One type of acceleration rights is good and common. Another you should avoid like the plague. In this video, I'm going to tell you which and why. Let's get started. All right, so let's first start with when acceleration rights come into play at all. Generally, acceleration rights are found in founder stock agreements. And what they refer to is how much of the founder stock accelerates or how much of it they get if there's a change in control of the company. So let's take a few steps back. This happens during investing. So in most founder stock for startups, especially Delaware startups, you'll find that the founder stock vests over typically 4 years. What that means is that within those 4 years, there's a certain amount of shares that the company can take back. Why do startups do this? And more importantly, why do founders allow themselves to go through that? Well, it's because when a startup is going to find funding from investors, the investors want to know that if they invest in a company, the founders will stay. In fact, the founders of the startup are typically more important than even the product they're selling. That's why you see crazy times when, for instance, SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, I think is his name, the founder of FTX, he was able to raise so much money because of who he was. Mark Zuckerberg was able to raise money because of who he was more so than his idea. The idea is good, it's important, but the founders are more important because you can have 5 different startups doing the same thing, but it's the founders that will determine whether the startup succeeds or it fails. So investors, VCs, typically want the founders to stay as long as possible after an investment. So if there is a vesting schedule such that to get all of their shares, meaning to protect all of their shares, the founder has to stay for those 4 years, then the investor, the VC, is sure that if they invest in a company, the founder will stay. A typical vesting schedule, like I mentioned before, is 4 years. There's typically what is called a 1-year cliff. What that means is for the first 1 year, all of the shares of the founder are subject to vesting. Now, there is a misconception about vesting. If you allow me going into this for a few seconds, there's a misconception about vesting that when vesting starts, the founder doesn't own the shares. That's not true for founder stock and most restricted stock. Most restricted stock actually already belong to the founder. So when you get the stock agreement and you sign it, typically you either pay money or you sign some intellectual property to the startup. Once that is done as a matter of law, you now actually do own the shares. Now, the shares just have some terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions are that within the first 1 year, if you leave the startup itself can decide to buy your shares, all of them 100% for the first 1 year. That's what's called the cliff. So in that first 1 year cliff, the startup, if you decide to leave, can buy all of your shares back. So you leave without anything. And the reason it's done that way is because now you're certain that the founder will stay for at least 1 year. At the end of the 1 year, 1/36 of the shares will vest every month. So at the end, it will take 3 years for the rest of the shares to vest. The longer you stay, the more shares you have. This way, VCs are guaranteed that the founder will stay for at least 4 years, or at least they have more incentive to stay for 4 years from the beginning of the startup. Now, acceleration rights say that. Down there's, like I mentioned, there are 2 types of acceleration rights. There's a good one and there's a bad one. The bad one is called a single trigger acceleration, and I'll tell you why it's bad a little later. But it's called a single trigger because it says that once there is a change in control, once the company, the startup, is acquired by another company or is acquired by a private equity firm or anybody that buys more than 50% of the firm, Elon Musk, once that happens, then the founder, all of his shares or her shares vest, meaning now the company has no right to buy any of their shares back, any of the founder's shares back. The founder gets all the shares. It accelerates the schedule such that now they don't need to wait 4 years. When there's a change in control, they own all the shares. I'll tell you why that's bad for the company in a second. But the good acceleration rights is called a double trigger. A double trigger says that once there's a change in control, so that's first trigger, change in control. Then it requires a second trigger, which is the founder gets fired. So if you think about certain startups where the bigger company, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is, once they buy a smaller company, sometimes they fire the founder. Sometimes they just want the technology. A double trigger sees that if one, somebody else buys the company, and two, they fire the founder. Now the founder can get all of their shares because it's not their fault. They didn't decide to leave, they got fired. So now they get all of their shares. Now, if you see a single trigger in a founder stock agreement or a restricted stock agreement created for a founder, and you're the founder, avoid a single trigger. It might look more tempting for you. After all, if somebody else buys your company and you don't really want to stay, then you want to leave. If you watch Silicon Valley, the show, you'll see something they call rest and vest, which is a scenario where another company, in that case, Huli, buys a smaller company, but they don't fire the founders. So the founders kind of just chill throughout for the next 3 or 4 years until their shares vest. If you're the founder, sometimes your incentive is to get single trigger. So if another company buys a company, you can leave. But then what ends up happening, and the reason VCs don't like this, is because if I am a purchaser and I'm trying to purchase your company, like I mentioned at the beginning, you, the founder, are like half the value of the company. The team that built the company is the most valuable part. They've proven they can execute. They've proven they understand the vision. So I want them to stay and keep building the company to the potential so that I get a return on my investment. If there's a single trigger that says once I buy the company, you can leave, there's no incentive for me to buy the company. VCs don't like it because now it's hard for them to market the company to somebody else to buy, and it's harder for them to get their money back. Now they have to offer a lower amount for the company they're trying to sell. And you, to the founder, it backfires on you because you could have gotten more for the company, but now you don't. So it's a trade-off that's not worth it long term. After all, risk in investing is not too bad. And you have some cases where, I think it's WhatsApp, for instance, where the founder just couldn't take it. So he initially lose some shares, but he didn't really care. He walked away to go and do something else better with his life. So there's a trade-off there. But generally, if you're a founder, do not allow single triggers to be in your founder stock agreement. Just make them double triggers. Now, when does this come into play? The truth is, in most restricted stock agreements for founders, there are only double trigger acceleration rights included in them. And this is what they'd look like. I'm putting it on the screen. And it just says that there's a change in control of the company. This is what happens. Now, in most cases, it's double trigger. It will take a change in control and it will take termination. But sometimes you're dealing with fractional chief technology officers or chief general counsels, fractional counsels that are giving their services in exchange for shares. And in those cases, sometimes they are business savvy. So in their agreements, they'll ask you to make it a single trigger. And if you don't know much about this, you're thinking, what's the difference? What's the point? But the reason they want the single trigger is because if another entity buys the company, they want the option to walk away. So it's good for them. But it's bad for you and for the value of your startup. Just don't do it. Just say no. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.